Ever since we first met him on the pages of Berserk, Griffith has been an enigma that has been nearly as tough to unravel for us as he was for his fellow mercenaries. He could pull insane battle strategies out of his mind like a magician pulls rabbits out of a hat, yet at the same time, if you saw him water fighting with Guts and giggling about his precious keepsake, you'd think that he was a total child. And once we actually get inside Griffith's head, kinda, we see that he's a torrent of mixed and conflicting thoughts and emotions, with no clear path ahead when he was at his lowest point in life. And then the eclipse happens, and we see what is a crystallization of his very essence. Griffith sacrifices those comrades who followed him despite his eccentricity, or perhaps because of it, and transforms himself into the fifth demon king, the Wings of Darkness, Femto. As an ephemeral existence that layers deep within the astral world, Femto is fundamentally different from Griffith, or at least he should be. When Rickard is on his way to meet Griffith in Falconia, he thinks back to their reunion on the Hill of Swords. He thinks that Griffith somehow seemed both less and more like himself at the same time, and Rickard remarks that it left quite an uncanny impression on him. But it got us thinking, what exactly does make Griffith and his reincarnation as Femto different, and why might that be an important detail for the end of the story of Berserk? It's an interesting question, so let's dive right into it. But before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. First, the similarities. Femto is basically Griffith's worst aspects turned up to 1,000,000. In Berserk, most things, especially demonic things, happen because they were kind of destined to happen. But in the case of Griffith, that is especially true. The White Falcon is one of only 5 people in known history to have received the Crimson Behelit and been given a chance to become a God Hand member, and that is extremely significant to his characterization as well. When Griffith first arrives within the interstice of his own creation, Ubik tells him that the only reason he could summon the demonic angels was because ever since he got possession of the Crimson Behelit, it signified his potential for becoming a demon himself. Or rather, because Griffith had that potential all along, he was bestowed with the Crimson Behelit by causality. Griffith is a guy who is many things, but he doesn't have a lot he wants to achieve besides acquiring his own kingdom. Well, that goal in and of itself requires him to learn about every facet of politics and warfare, which by definition is a lot. It does not diminish the fact that the driving force behind Griffith's life was his desire to become king. One of his first formative thoughts as a street orphan in an unnamed city was to acquire his most sacred piece of junk, that being the castle that shines so brightly in his eyes. Griffith would often play with his friends and trade trinkets as a pastime, but when he saw that castle, he knew he wanted it more than anything else in the world, so much so that when the fortune teller who gave him his Behelit told him he would obtain the world in exchange for his flesh and blood, he didn't bat an eyelid at her claims. He just paid her and bought the souvenir because he thought it was a neat little symbol for his ambitions. Little did he know it was the literal key to his ultimate fate. See, from the point he was introduced to the point he was thrown into the Tower of Rebirth and tortured for a whole year, Griffith was presented to us as this maverick genius of a guy who could win unwinnable battles and woo women that he was not even meant to be talking to. He was everything that we wanted to be ourselves, a commoner who grasped success with his 2 hands and held onto it against insurmountable odds. But there were signs that he wasn't exactly as chaotic good as we initially perceived him to be, even early on in his appearances, and the first example of this is when he dislocated Guts' soldier without hesitation and then simply declared that he now belonged to Griffith and that Griffith would decide where he dies. Griffith tended to view people as playthings, pieces on a chessboard that he was moving around as the ultimate grand master of the game. He had no regrets for selling himself to Genon in exchange for money, and he showed zero remorse when he heard that Count Julius's son, Adonis, had also died as a consequence of the assassination mission he had sent Guts upon. Instead, he smiled a wicked smile, and this happened right after he made it clear to Princess Charlotte that none of his comrades were his friends in the first place. Griffith, as a martyr to the god named Dream, thought that someone who had their own dream and fought for it as fervently as he fought for his own was the only person he could truly call his friend. To him, the Band of the Falcon was an indispensable tool for acquiring his dream, but a tool nonetheless. The same goes for Princess Charlotte, whose chambers he was trying to charm his way into because she was the quickest route he could take to the throne. By marrying her, his ascendance to the throne would become all but imperative once the current king of Midland died, and so, as you can tell, everything about Griffith's life has been working towards his personal goal of achieving what he thinks will define his place in the world. Griffith once told Guts that regardless of their birth or station, there are a few men in the world who make it revolve the way it does. Those men are the true golden elites, and he wanted to know what his place amongst them was. Turns out, his place was as the index finger of the demonic hand of God and as the fake savior of mankind, who is actually sent to Earth to lead them all to their doom. Go watch our videos on the dark truth of Falconia and the prophecy of the Falcon to learn more about that. The moment that Griffith decides to sacrifice his comrades in exchange for power that would allow him to reach the highest summit, his luminous body descends deep into the abyss, where he learns that when a person experiences suffering so profound that it rends their soul apart, a heart becomes frozen, and a human becomes a demon. The Lost Chapter, Chapter 83, goes more in depth on this idea, but basically what we learn is when a human being accepts their destiny as an apostle or a god hand, the part that defined their humanity in their previous life is crystallized in one place. That place also becomes the total and absolute sum of their worldly ambitions, which they then tend to carry out within their new context as a demonic apostle or a member of the god hand. The last thing that Griffith did before he was imprisoned was sleep with Princess Charlotte, not out of love or lust, but out of a sense of slipping control. When Guts freed himself from Griffith's grasp, the White Falcon felt his power as a leader and a man depart with the Black Swordsman. In order to regain a modicum of control over this mental and emotional spiral, he sleeps with Charlotte, whom he borderline coerces into coupling with him. The last thing that Griffith does as a mangled human whose body could no longer rise without assistance was try and force himself on Casca, because, once again, he saw her behavior towards Guts had changed in his year-long imprisonment, and, once again, he felt his control over her slip away from his now defunct hands. While Charlotte gave in to Griffith and became powerless at his advance, Casca made Griffith realize how helpless he himself had become now that his body could no longer serve his dream. So when he was reincarnated as Femto, the first thing he did was violate Casca in front of Guts to reclaim the power and control over his own story that he felt he had lost as a human being. In the Black Swordsman arc, he openly berated Guts' existence as being worthless, and called the Apostles inconsequential servants, which is the same opinion he held of the Black Swordsman and his Band of the Falcon as a human. He just never said it out loud. And ever since he's been incarnated in a body of flesh, Griffith has dedicated himself entirely to acquiring his dream by any means necessary. He has become the master of the same apostles he once almost feared as monsters whose existence defies earthly logic. He rescues Princess Charlotte from her prison in the Tower of Rebirth and becomes her betrothed, as well as the prophesied savior as the acknowledged Falcon of Light. Griffith is now the literal embodiment of the concept of the divine right of kings, and he is steamrolling his way through the denizens of Fantasia in order to establish his own continental empire, a la Supreme King Gyseric. He has pretty much acquired his most sacred piece of junk in the absolute behemoth that is the Falcon's castle. When Rickard said that Griffith somehow felt more like himself when he saw him on the Hill of Swords, this was what he meant. As Femto, Griffith is now nothing more than a condensed, idealized version of himself, fully devoid of any constraints that would hold him back from procuring his dream. When he sees Guts on that hill, the man he blamed for practically all of his downfalls, he remarks that he is finally free. Griffith is no longer bound by things like emotion and subjective morality. When he had Guts assist him with kidnapping Minister Foss's daughter and then setting half of Midland's royal court ablaze, he asked him if he thought he was cruel. Back then, Guts replied that he was just Griffith's soldier, and as long as it was in service of his dream, then that's all that mattered anyways. When they met again at the Hill of Swords after Griffith had dedicated himself to solely pursuing his dream, Guts was the one who was agitated by the White Falcon's inhuman sacrifice, while Griffith was the one telling him he should have known that this is the man he's always been. So, to make a long story short, Femto is basically Griffith in his ideal state. He is everything Griffith thought he lacked at the moment he triggered the 5th eclipse, and then some. And that is where we would have ended this video, except there are a couple of glaring differences between Femto and Griffith, and ironically enough, it's centered on the concept of morality. Griffith at least had a shred of humanity left in him, even when he went insane from torture. Femto is 100% evil. The biggest difference between Femto and Griffith. We think the key difference between Griffith and Femto is exemplified through two different mediums by Kentaro Miura in Berserk. The first is his explanation of why he chose to sell his body to Governor Genon, and the second is his friendship with Guts. We'll explain the first because we've spent quite a bit of time arguing against the second point, and that is going to need more elaboration. So, when Casca tells Guts about her backstory and how she came to join the Band of the Falcon, she brings up two things that show you Griffith wasn't always the cold and calculating bastard he ended up turning into. The first is when he saved her from being violated by a nobleman. This was the first encounter Casca ever had with Griffith, and to her, in that moment, he felt more like a godsend than anything she'd experienced in her life. Griffith showed up, sliced off the nobleman's ear, and threw his sword at Casca's feet, urging her to take control of her own life. He also berated the nobleman for thinking that just because he is of peerage, he has the right to do whatever he pleases. It was this empowerment, the sword and the blanket Griffith gave Casca that day, that inspired her to follow his lead wherever he went, and eventually made her fall for him. It's downright disgusting that Griffith ended up doing the same thing he once saved Casca from all those years ago, but at least back then, he wasn't trying to angle for power or anything like that. Griffith genuinely wanted to save a helpless little girl from a predatory old man, and that's about as white knight as you can get. Then, later, when he's recounting his reasons for sleeping with Governor Genon, most of his argument is based on cold, harsh truth. But there comes a point where it becomes evident that Griffith did, at one point, really care about his men. As Griffith is defending his actions with Genon to Casca, explaining how Genon's money would allow him to fulfill his dream while reducing his casualties, Griffith starts clawing into his own flesh at the thought of the thousands of corpses his campaign for becoming king had created. He tears open his own flesh, thinking about how, even though he doesn't feel responsible for the deaths of his comrades, he does hate feeling unclean whilst they die in the hundreds. Earlier in the campaign, under Genon's patronage, Griffith had expressed grief and personally sent off one of his fallen young recruits to the afterlife, musing whether it was his dream that killed the boy. Griffith had always known the effect he had on people, but just because of that, was it fair that he be the only person not sacrificing something for his own cause? Sure, it's a selfish reason, but Griffith has never been able to quantify his emotions properly. If he had, he'd have realized that somewhere deep down, sleeping with Genon was his way of repaying the many fallen comrades who had fought under his falcon banner. Because of his arrogant and selfish desire, Griffith outwardly rejected the notion that anything he did could be based off of emotional attachment to his people, not realizing that it was that very attachment that made them viable sacrifices for his future ascension in the first place. And then there's Guts. Griffith will never admit it, but he trusted and cared for Guts like a best friend would. Many in the fandom think he was in love with Guts and just couldn't handle that fact, but we don't think that's the case. Kentaro Miura has stated on multiple occasions that his primary inspiration behind the Band of the Falcon and the conflict between Guts and Griffith is the very idea of friendship. Many of the OG band's members are modeled after Miura's real-life friends. Pippin is basically a self-portrait, according to Miura, but if you take that description and put it into the context we've just given you about Griffith's emotional fragility, then a lot of Berserk starts to make sense, doesn't it? See, Griffith might think that his only true friend can be someone who's his equal, but he doesn't exactly realize when he's saying all this that the one person he already treats like his equal is Guts. Ever since he first met Guts, Griffith identified with the swordsman because, like the White Falcon, Guts fought by putting his life on the line every time and aiming for absolute victory and nothing less. After Griffith injures and subdues Guts for the first time, he tells him that he thinks Guts fights as if he isn't afraid to die, when the truth is probably the opposite, and though he never says this part outright, Griffith can relate to that wholeheartedly. A lot of people tend to forget that Griffith is a dude who literally came from nothing. He was a commoner who raised himself on the streets and has taken everything he has today by force of strength or wit. The same goes for Guts, except he rarely gets the chance to demonstrate his wits, as his life is more battle-centric. The reason why Griffith names Guts rearguard in his first fight as a Falcon, and gives him the kind of free rein as Raider Captain of the band he does, is not just because Guts is his best fighter, it's also because Guts truly gets the circumstances of Griffith's rise. Griffith chooses to rely on Guts for his dirty work because, according to him, Guts is more suited for the kind of roughhousing that comes with kidnapping and assassination than, say, Judo, who was a nimble tumbler and expert knife-throwing marksman, or Corcus, a literal former thief. Sure, Guts doesn't question orders a lot and always finds a way to complete his mission regardless of the situation. It is this base connection that they both share as men trying to find their feet in the big bad world that makes Griffith's relationship with Guts pre-departure a cornerstone of his humanity. When Guts leaves Griffith, the White Falcon completely breaks down because he knows what it means for his future military exploits, but also because deep down, he feels like he's just lost the only person who ever truly understood him. During Griffith's imprisonment in the Tower of Rebirth, only two things keep him from going full psycho: his dream and Guts. who now burned just as bright as that fabled castle within his consciousness. Griffith feels a surge of emotions whenever he thinks of Guts from his cell, and that, in itself, is what makes him completely different from Femto. As a demonic angel, Femto is completely devoid of all morality and emotion. He feels nothing when he sees Guts and Rickert, and he says nothing about killing Flora or destroying Elfhelm to his fellow Falconians because he knows that all is flowing according to his grand will. The reason why Griffith saves Casca at the Hill of Swords and then kidnaps her and brings her to Falconia is the Moonlight Boy, aka Guts and Casca's demon child, whose body fused into his human vessel. The feelings Griffith's incarnated body feels on rare occasions do not belong to him. Griffith himself has acknowledged that the momentary sense of nostalgia he feels every full moon when he transforms is but ephemeral to him personally, because when he returns, he's no longer being controlled by the demon child. But before he becomes a god hand, Griffith makes Guts the object of his obsessive emotions, and it is proof that he used to have a human heart. He just didn't have the ability to acknowledge it to himself. The first thing he tries to do when Guts comes to rescue him and hugs him with tears in his eyes is to try to strangle the man. Our protagonist misses this because he is too busy blaming himself for Griffith's current state, but once Griffith notices this too, he relents and lets Guts hug him. Throughout his escape, his reactions and body language are mixed, because on the one hand, he helps his rescue party escape Wyndham and is highly appreciative of Guts coming back for him after all this time. But on the other hand, he can't help but blame Guts for his condition, because accountability and Griffith do not go hand in hand. And, moreover, Griffith was likely insane by this point in time. A full calendar year of torture that would make Ramsay Bolton's treatment of Theon Greyjoy seem tame can do that to a man. And Griffith himself questions his own sanity even before being broken out of prison. All the issues he's caused in the world of Berserk ever since he sacrificed his comrades could have been avoided if he knew that the reason his sacrifice worked was because he cared for them deep down in his soul. Griffith was a fundamentally different person from Femto before he reached his breaking point, but his ambition was so grand that he couldn't even see it himself until it was too late. So when Rickert says that Griffith was not himself when he saw him on the Hill of Swords, he was talking about this frozen-hearted God Hand member he was now seeing in front of his eyes, not the White Falcon that was once his leader. The differences between Griffith and Femto ceased to exist the day Griffith decided he was going to pursue his dream and let nothing stand in the way. And if you ask us, that is just as big a tragedy in Berserk as Guts' entire life. A marvelous verdict. But as for this particular piece of character analysis, we're afraid the tragedy is that that's all we have for you. Griffith is one of the most layered characters in all of Berserk, and while it is true that none of his actions can be painted plain old black and white, the shades of gray he exists in are so varied and diverse that you can't help but think he isn't even who he used to be back when we met him during the Golden Age. As a human, Griffith was perhaps the most inspirational person in all of Berserk from a distance, and the savior of a kingdom he intended to rule at some point in the future. As Femto, he still wants that kingdom, but now he has cast his humanity aside. But what do you guys think about all this? Do you think Griffith and Femto are one and the same? Or do you agree with us that they weren't always that way, but Griffith made it so in his mad scramble for power? Let us know in the comments section down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one.